This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Now we're going to look at the question DinZee Co, which was the large 30-mark question from the December 2007 examination. It's very typical of a 30-mark question insofar as it's broken down here into 4 parts. Before reading the question, it's recommended that you read some of the requirements. This orientates you, it alerts you about what the question is likely to be about. Part A, it's talking about procedures that will be carried out in the purchaser system. Part B and C look at inventory counts. Part D again talks about the inventory. So this question is going to contain information about the purchaser system and the inventory count. Now we can go and look at the question better prepared to understand what we should be on the lookout for and what areas might be particularly relevant in answering the question. Before going on, it's suggested that you read the question carefully. Part A. It asks us to list 6 audit procedures that the auditor would normally carry out. Note that it's asking about procedures. It's not asking here about internal controls. What it's saying is when you as an auditor go in to check the purchaser system, what audit checks would you carry out? There are 12 marks. It wants 6 procedures. So almost certainly there's going to be 1 mark for identifying the procedures and 1 mark for explaining the reason for each procedure. A very easy way to lose 6 marks is not to explain the reason why you're carrying out those procedures. Part B asks for 4 audit procedures that the auditor would normally carry out prior to attending the client's premises on the day of the inventory count. There's only 2 marks for this, so it'll be half a mark for each of these procedures, and it'll be all to do with planning and the advanced work that may be necessary before you actually go to the inventory count. Part C explains something about the inventory count. We have to list a weakness in a control system for counting inventory. We have to explain why it is a weakness and state how that weakness can be overcome. There's 3 elements there, and almost certainly that means we have to look for 4 weaknesses, because that will give us 12 marks, 1 for the weakness, 1 for explaining why it is a weakness, and 1 for stating how the weakness can be overcome. Finally, a relatively simple and straightforward part of the question: what's the difference between a test of control and substantive procedure, and then give examples of those drawn from the inventory count. What you should be thinking about is an efficient format, particularly for parts A and for part C. It's very common to have to identify a problem, explain it, and then suggest ways of rectifying a problem. And you should always be mindful that perhaps the most efficient way of writing your answer is to put it into a table, effectively in columnar form. The column on the left can identify the problem. The column in the middle can, if necessary, explain why it is a problem. and the column on the right can contain your suggestions for how the problem can be overcome. This is efficient to produce and it's terribly easy to mark. And remember, if something is easy to mark, you're likely to get the marks. Looking at part A, you'll see that the original question data is divided into a series of paragraphs. Generally speaking, the way this will be set out is each paragraph is dealing with a small step in a transaction. And you normally expect to find some sort of weakness if we're dealing with internal control, or here, as we're dealing with what audit tests we will perform, you generally expect to be able to invent some sort of audit procedure you carry out for each paragraph. This is a logical way for the information to be provided for you. A little step in the procedure will require its own controls, and those controls will require their own audit procedures to verify them. Remember to take your cue from what's in the question. Really, the longer the question, the more detail is being supplied to you, and the easier it should be to use that detail in answering your question. In many ways, the hardest question is the short question. It gives very little away to you, and you have to rely much more on inventing. In this question, the amount of detail given means that it should be relatively easy for you to identify 6 audit procedures that will be useful. Before looking at the model answer, try to identify 6 audit procedures and explain why each of them would be performed. Similarly, when we go to part C, there are 6 paragraphs. Start with the assumption that each paragraph will contain a weakness. It might not, but normally it will. If the examiner wants you to identify weaknesses, he will supply them, and the logical way to supply them is 1 weakness per paragraph. Again, before looking at our model answer, look through these 6 steps and see if you can identify a weakness, explain why it is a weakness, and suggest how it could be overcome.